University. She's a professor of environmental history, and she just has a fascinating talk. I saw it last night at the Exhibition Center. And the story of why Amahia is here is because she called Vicki Richmond to interview her for a book about people being active on the Missouri River and bringing human life back to the river, which was a great topic. So there are a couple of announcements I have. Next week we're going to have Connor Beasley. He's an environmentalist author. And who knows what he'll talk about, but since he's an environmentalist and author, I think it'll be fascinating. We have some flyers out. We have Project Blue River Rescue that's coming up on April 6th. It's a huge volunteer effort. We expect to have about 1,000 volunteers this year to clean up the Blue River. And whenever you guys come out in hordes, we're able to clean up more and longer stretches of the river for the city. And it's wonderful. So, and we've also got, for the mitigation bugs in the crowd and people that just like the river, we've got a flyer on the mitigation project that's going on and its progress and where you can find information. That's all here today. Final reminder, if you haven't, please sign in and we'll get you the information. We'll put you on our mailing list and stuff. So without further saying nothing that's really important, I'm going to hand it over to Amahia so she can say the really interesting things. Thank you.
It's great to be here. I know that you already have your river credentials, and so I have my river credentials as well. I just want to share with you. I not only know the Missouri on paper and in the archives, but I've done my share of river release, and I have biked for 6 weeks on the Missouri River. That was a long time ago. That was back when I had one time and didn't actually have a job. But I have yet to finish the final leg of my journey, which is from Garrison Dam in North Dakota to the source of the Missouri River. So put this closer to my mouth.
Yeah.
Turn the volume down. But wow, this is really fast. What I'm going to talk about today is less about the Missouri River and a little bit more about comparing the situation here in Kansas City to other cities in the world and what they have done with their urban and industrial rivers. So I have chosen the topic no longer estranged because I like to think of the Missouri River and Kansas City relationship, Kansas City as a relationship. So to be estranged means it's like being separated, right? You've had a falling out. But it doesn't mean that the relationship has completely ended. And the way that I would characterize Kansas City's relationship with its rivers is that once upon a time, this was a river city to its core, its economy, its politics, its culture, that it has forgotten that in its culture. It still remains important. It still is a river city. People just aren't aware of it. They've forgotten it. And that has happened since the mid-century. But what I have noticed is that there's a resurgence. In the last 20 years or so, we're beginning to see people coming back to the river. And this is a room full of evidence that is happening. So I'll come back to the Missouri, and then I'd like to, at the end of this, open it up to you to hear about your ideas, your contributions. Perhaps you can help me write the last chapter of my book. So, why am I fascinated with rivers, and why are other academics fascinated with rivers? You can look at the river through most any lens. You could examine it as politics. You can read it through the lens of the Corps of Engineers. You can read this through the lens of politics. policy through the Gippsland Act. You can see this as a social space, as a cultural space. But you can also use the river as a way to simplify, to boil down all of these things into one place. This entire landscape that this river runs through, it represents all of these places, all of these people, and all of these lenses. And so it becomes a teaching tool. So why urban rivers? The majority of Americans live in cities. Most of us live in cities. We know our environments through urban waterways. And this is the way that our relationship that we are a part of is taking place. It's happening in the city. Not only that, but the majority of Americans are suburban. 70% of Americans are living in the city today. The suburbs, not here, right? This is the core city. This is the old city where we are now. The suburban relationship with waterways is even more complicated because it's even less obvious where they might be because they're underground. So you don't have a Missouri River. So the old part of the city near the river, you can still see the Missouri River. Can you see the streams? Where are the streams around us here and farther out into the suburbs? They've disappeared underground as part of the storm sewer system. So it's important to talk about urban waterways because this is actually how most of us are connected to our cycle. Is through urban waterways that may not even be visible to us. And altered as they may be, they still are our environment. So here are a few examples. I have more than this, but these are 4 stories that I'm going to talk about. Cities that have gone through renewal processes, that have used the city planners and activists and environmentalists have used the river as the core of their urban changes. I'm going to talk about Portland, Bilbao, Spain, Des Moines, and Grand Forks. I've lived in all 4 of these cities, and I have a few others examples as well. So let me start with Portland. This is the Willamette River. This is, in the 1960s, what was next to the river, a multi-lane highway. If you lived in downtown Portland, it would be very difficult to get down to the river because there was no public access. At the time, Tom McCall, a Republican governor, a progressive governor, who responded to environmentalist calls in the 1960s to clean up pollution in the river, ended up helping to bring about the creation of a waterfront park. So here is a picture in 1928, the city's relationship with the river, industrial. Here's what this place looks like today. And this is the Tom McCall Waterfront Park. This is one of the more famous public waterfront places. It is in place by the 1970s, which means it's one of the earlier ones in the United States as well. Think for a minute of what this does to an urban environment. Downtown is over here. If you have property near this space, your property values go up. People want to be near this space. It's going to attract people. So this is a very desirable urban space. It is a public space. From the river, you can see that this is still an active waterfront. This is during the Rose Festival. These are military ships that have come in for the Rose Festival. The port is still active, just a little bit farther downstream. So this is a river that is taking big boats. And here's what it looks like when a festival is going. This is a beer festival. So look how many people are attracted to the waterfront. The next city I want to talk about is Bilbao, which is in the Basque Country in northern Spain. Has anyone been to? Okay. So this was the industrial behemoth of Spain. This city provided 40% of the iron ore for England's Industrial Revolution. It produced the majority of goes through. Now, the site that I want you to note is this one here because it's in the process of being cleared for the museum. You can see that this is still warehouses. Boats still do come up and down. This was a dead river. This was a river that was taking open sewage from the city. It didn't have fish in it, and if it had fish, don't eat them. But historically, people remember, my grandmother remembers that you used to be able to fish for what we call ingula. And these are the baby eels, which are a delicacy. And 100 years ago, you could get those out of this river. And so there still is a living memory of being able to use this river for sustenance, for food. Well, this is what's going to happen. Frank Gehry will be commissioned to build a Guggenheim Museum on that very spot. Now, what does this museum look like?
A ship.
A ship, yes. So, in making it look like a ship, it puts in titanium, not in concrete, it puts in titanium the history of this city. This was a shipping city. This was an industrial city. Some people say that it looks like a whale. The Basques were also whalers. And so this shiny titanium building in the middle of this just black, seedy, rusty city sticks out. And all up and down, here's the rust, here's the color of rust. All up and down the courts in the 1990s. This building officially opens in 97. Frank Gehry falls in love with the Basque Country, buys a house there. I'm sure that you've seen Gehry architecture in other places, the Disney Theater in LA, etc. He's considered one of the most important architects of the 20th century, 21st as well. So here is that color of the rust. This is Altos Hornos again. Now here are some pieces of art. This is Richard Serra's Bilbao. Here is Jorge Otesa's public. This is right on the river. Here's the Nervion here. So this is some of the public art that has started to go in along the river. And this is the Oshkolduna, which is a space for the public arts. It's a grand theater, where you can go see the opera, etc. Again, note the rust, note the color that has been used. It's actually the metal. This is iron. So the very iron that is mined here, that is manufactured here, that is shipped out of here, is the building block for much of the art in the buildings in this renewal process. Again, these are actually advertisements for a bank, but they have used shipping crates, drawing on that history, that industrial history of shipping. They've used shipping crates that are made of iron as part of their artful advertisement. And this is a big pool where ships used to be repaired that they have held on to. Again, you can see the river in the background. They began putting in pedestrian bridges. So you're attracting people down to the waterfront. You need to put art there for people to look at. Keep these spaces open. Keep them public. And give people ways to more directly see the river and to be able to cross the river. So we have a number of pedestrian bridges. This is by one of the most famous architects in the world for building bridges, Altos. And this is called the Subi Subi Bridge, which is glass on the bottom. And this is the most recent piece of architecture that has gone in. It has nothing to do with the history, but note that it's feeding off of the fact that this has redeveloped and is now this great public space. It's not only appealing to people who live in the city, but it's appealing to tourists. So where it is, Iberdrola, which is a company that deals in alternative energy, they actually own a lot of energy plants here in the U.S. as well. They built it right here by the river. You can see another pedestrian bridge. And here's what this area looks like now. So you can see there's the Oshkolduna. All of this that used to be docks has now become green space, and you have numerous bridges, some of them for pedestrians across the river, and the anchor of this is the Raccoon. So this became the model for other cities. Bilbao was, wow, if we could get a Guggenheim, what would happen to us? All cities started asking this. Guggenheim was like, wow, we're just going to start opening a franchise. People will pay us to bring their Guggenheim. I want to stress that the way that Bilbao developed was local government going to the Guggenheim, local government going outside of itself and collaborating with the Guggenheim to bring it, knowing that if they did this, that it would change the city. And indeed it did. So it's building on its history. And it's saying, we may have a tough and grimy history, but we can use that to our advantage. We will embrace our history, and we will make something better. So I live in Iowa now, and if you build it, they will come. And that's a story, again and again, as a historian that I see in urban planning. If you want to change the way people use their cities, build something that will cause them to change the way they use their cities. Infrastructure matters. So, one of our newest bridges in Iowa is the Trestle Trail. This is a former railroad bridge that crosses the Des Moines River. It's about 25 miles upstream from the city. It's now a place that you can bicycle to. I can get there from my yard. I can just leave my garage and my bicycle, and I can get here. Never going onto a road. I can get there by trail all the way. It's a place that you can drive to as well. It's accessible. So it's this beautiful bridge over the river that you can see has been very artfully redone. Here's what it looks like from the side. And this is what it looks like at night. Again, how did this happen? This happened because of an amazing collaboration, a nonprofit organization called the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. They started with the fundraising, and ultimately, once they had raised the millions of dollars needed to hire architects, to have all of the property rights, etc., they then turned this over to the cities to manage and to own. So no one city could have done this by themselves. The cities probably didn't have the initiative, the organizing skills to do this on their own. And you don't want to have any prima donnas in the mix, right? You don't want to have any one city thinking they can control the process. So the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, this nonprofit, gets all of the stakeholders at the table and says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to organize it. We're going to fundraise. You're going to be a part of this process. So nothing that happens is what you want. And ultimately, we turn it over to you to run and manage. So here's where I live now. Drake University is in Des Moines, which is currently the best, ranked #1 by Forbes magazine place for young professionals in the United States, and the best city to retire to. So, if you're old, if you're young, Des Moines has it. What has been happening, as I've learned, I've been living in Des Moines for 6 years now, and I know that I see a renaissance happening. But people have told me the last 10 years have been amazing. Things have really been happening. Well, you should have seen Des Moines 20 years ago. And in fact, I've read urban planners' scathing assessments of Des Moines. Downtown Des Moines, what a pit. There's nobody there. Just awful, terrible. All of the growth has gone out to the suburbs. So what has Des Moines done that has begun to cause a shift? One of it is cultural. There are all kinds of young people who are active. Young people who are creating social organizations that meet in abandoned buildings downtown, things like this. Our version of the Chamber of Commerce, we unfortunately do not have a regional government. Our chamber is about the best that we have as far as regional governance or organizing goes. But they've been very supportive of redevelopment downtown because, they're interested in property values. So they have self-interest in this. They've worked with all of these cultural groups. They have worked with the city. We have a very supportive mayor. And we have a lot of green space here. That's great. Green space along your river is a great idea for all of these cities, especially if you live in the Midwest, for example, where it floods. So it's much better to put property that can flood near the river. So having recreation and green space by the river is a great idea. It hasn't been all that long since Des Moines has had a serious flood. In the time that I lived here in 2008, for example, we had a serious flood. We had a levee break. We had houses go underwater. Downtown has survived, although I did get to witness a few, what they call those poppers. Sewer tops pop off and the water starts coming out from the downtown area. But increasingly what has happened is that the city is focusing resources in this area along the river. We found a redevelopment of East Village, which is the area between the Capitol and the river. A very stunning layout to have this gold domed Capitol up on the hill and at its feet, the river. And now it is one almost long strip of continuous businesses, restaurants, and even some blocks. We now have 10,000 people living in downtown. That has happened for basically the last 10, 15 years that this has gone down. Just last year, we opened our first, well, not our first, I'm sorry, we have 5 pedestrian bridges in the community. This is the most recent one. It's still kind of under development here in this style. It is like, it's not a calatrava, but it has the similar look to it, and it also has, here in the middle, it actually splits in half, and there is glass, so that you can look down, and there's a dam right here, a low dam. And so you get the feeling of the water and the sound. We also have an extensive trail system. You can go hundreds of miles on trails outside and around Des Moines. I can be critical about this. Other ones say, oh, Des Moines done it all perfectly. Frankly, it's great if you want to drive your car to the trail.
Oh, sure thing. I'll give you so much.
But we don't have infrastructure in the city for getting to the trail, so our interconnectivity is not very good. And the mode of transportation, we don't have very good. So we're not perfect either. But we do have this fantastic trail system. And it uses the rivers as its backbone. And finally, something that Iowa is not nearly as developed as you guys are. Iowa does not have anything like river. This comes from the grassroots. It's much more, what we do have is something called Project Aware, which is actually operated by our Department of Natural Resources. But here's something that Project Aware does that's really interesting. They go out, and this is Drake School of Journalism, they go out in groups with students, and they pick up trash in their canoes over the span of a week. They canoe down the river. So it's a much more long-term, intimate relationship with the river than a one-day river relief. Although those of you who are river relief volunteers know it's probably a little bit more like that, only for like 100 people, more intensive. And then they collaborate with an artist. And this artist makes art from the things, the junk that's pulled from the river. So what this is called River Gates. This is on the our state fairgrounds in Des Moines, and it represents a river. And these are paddles, and kind of water droplets in here. And every single year, while at the state fair, he puts on a show. He's a very gregarious gentleman, and he's got all of his welding material, and he invites the public in to help him. And he has all these piles of junk that are collected by Project Aware volunteers, and he lets the public, while standing next to the art that's already been done, he lets the public weld it all together. So, and then he refuses to actually put his name on it. He says, it's not really my work, I just help. This belongs to everybody who has it. Next example is Grand Forks, North Dakota, and east of Grand Forks, Minnesota on the Red River. The Red River flows north. This is a bit of a problem because melting happens in the south, which means it happens upstream. So this is terrible if you are downstream on the Red River, where it's still frozen, but you have meltwater coming. The opposite happens here in the Missouri Basin. Warmer downstream, and as the warmth moves upstream, it continues to melt. So they are perennially having problems on the Red River. This is Grand Forks and East Grand Forks across the river in 1995. They had a severe flood that flooded 80% of the city. The year that I lived there was 10 years after. I was there in 2005 at the university. And this is, for example, this is the front page of the New York Times the day after. Downtown caught fire. And it was so flooded, there was no water to pump. There was no way to get trucks in here. And so some of the buildings, maybe 10, 15% of the buildings were simply lost to fire. So on the 10th anniversary, they were commemorating this flood and looking back. And it was very interesting to be there at that point. Most people in Grand Forks, though they thought the flood a tragedy, had a rather positive take on what had happened since then. So here's what happens. The federal government came in and said, okay, we're going to help. The Corps of Engineers said, we're going to reorganize your city so this never happens again. So what they did is they erected 2 walls stretching for about 10 miles going through the city. These are huge walls. They're made of concrete and reinforced steel. Although they look like they're stone and brick. They're quite attractive flood walls. And they had to do a lot of buyouts of homes. Maybe 100 or so, maybe more homes had to be bought out. So if you're walking around on the other side, on the river side, you can come across sidewalks that are still there from someone's home. There are still, fruit trees and oak trees that once used to be in someone's yard. So it's kind of a ghost town on the other side. But all of that became a public space. So here's what it looks like from the other side of the wall. There are trails. You can't hear the city once you're inside the walls down by the river. And you can go in a loop 10 miles each way, so a 20-mile loop if you're on a bike, for example, or if you're running. Every few blocks there's an entrance, an opening in the wall so that people can go into this walkway or into this riverway. So it's become an amenity. So for example, when I interviewed at the university, they were like, let's show you a tour, let's show you our green space. This is something to show off, something that the city and the university was proud of, and they used it as a recruiting tool. Now, one thing I do want to, yes?
How far is the setback of the flood wall from the river?
The wall would be up around here, maybe a little farther back. But there's sort of, it flattens out here, and there's a trail, and then there's the wall. And something I want to mention is that there are places where it widens even more. It depends on the geography. The Corps basically said, we're just going to listen to the numbers. The numbers are what will decide where this wall goes. So in other words, how many cubic square feet of water we need to deal with in a 100-year flood, and the wall will go there. Now, the way that this works out, after the flood, was that it was basically middle-class and working-class homes that were in the way. And the very nice homes, there's a street of mansions, are right next to the flood wall. They stay. And so there is a little bit of, there's a memory that in Grand Forks that when the Corps made their decisions and the city supported that, the nicest real estate stayed while the real estate that had lesser value was bought out. When it rains, this is what happens. They close off all of the openings. So here's the bridge that you saw earlier. They close off the openings, These things slide down all through the neighborhoods. The openings are closed off. And they let it rain. And this is what it looked like in 2006, maybe 2007. And it worked. This time. But the reason I point this out is in part because this has become a model for the Corps of Engineers. Fargo wants what Grand Forks has. And the Corps of Engineers has come here and examined this community and said, here we did it right. It's held up against the water and the public is happy with it. And after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, on the 10th anniversary of the floods in Grand Forks, they came up and inspected this community to find out what worked so that they could apply it in New Orleans. So let me show you some other cities. Here we are upstream. We have the Cargill complex. Has anyone been to the Conagra? I'm sorry. Oh, they have this huge complex, and I was just up there for a conference this week, and it turns out that in the 1970s, Omaha had an idea to do an urban renewal project. Now you guys know that urban renewal went dangerously awry in the 50s and 60s. And that the first, and what was wrong? What was wrong with urban renewal? What do you know was wrong with urban renewal in the 50s and 60s?
That makes sense that it's hired by erosion. It's just a bad idea.
Okay, so it seems ill-informed. Think of the ways it might have been ill-informed from an economic perspective.
I don't know about economic and social. It took out for
Exactly.
and it isolated
Exactly.
with those freeways.
Exactly. Urban renewal through the 1960s was also known as light removal. And it was also when all the interstates got built. The 1950s and 60s ruined downtown Kansas City. When the interstate got built here, you A, wipe out a lot of communities, and B, you segregate. And that has happened in cities all over the United States. So we are still dealing with the ramifications of that renewal. The social ramifications were, the thought was, if you erase poor communities, they'll just disappear. And instead, you actually, heighten you just heighten the crisis for poor communities. So in the 1970s, Omaha had this similar idea where they were going to create a kind of a moat in their city, in their downtown area, do a renewal project around the river. And a lot of that did not come to be. However, it planted the seed early in the 70s that they needed to do a renewal project around the river. And so I think that's one of the reasons why Omaha's a little bit ahead of the game here. So this is their pedestrian bridge. Here's a pedestrian bridge in Chicago at Millennium Park. It looks like a Gary, it may or may not be, I'm not sure. Providence, Rhode Island. Uncovered its river. This river used to be underground. They actually had parking lots covering it. And beginning in the 1980s and 90s, they began to unearth their river and to do redevelopment projects. And so here's the different angle of this. Again, public art, public space, a really important part to these renewal projects. Another renewal project not related to the river, but important to note because it comes from the grassroots is the High Line. Anyone here been to the High Line? Yes? What's it like? Cool. It's impressive. Yeah. I mean, you don't even have to go up in a skyscraper. So this is what the High Line looks like when you're up here. What this is this is an abandoned railroad. It's above, it's a story up from the street, and it was a meatpacking railroad. So it's how the meatpackers used to move things around the warehouse district. So they built their own private railroad. It was abandoned, and you can see all kinds of trees were growing up there. So what they did is a group of people in the community came up with this idea. they were like, it's kind of like you get into another world when you go up on the High Line. You know, the kids would go up there, mess around, people who knew how to get there would go up and off and around. It was basically completely unused. And so a group of activists in the community got together, friends of the High Line, and they converted this into a public space. And so now it is a place for people to walk, for people to sunbathe, where you sit and people watch. They've left the tracks in places. It's very artful. They've also left the seeds that have blown there from other places that have started to grow. Here's what it looks like from farther up. And here's what it looks like from the street. This is where the High Line ends. I also want to mention the Los Angeles River, because this is an extreme example. The Los Angeles River, most people think nature doesn't exist in LA, right? LA is the antithesis of nature, right? So, and that's precisely one of the reasons why it makes such an interesting case study, is our assumption that if LA has a river, it certainly couldn't exist any longer, and it is unredeemable, right? There's no way that you could have redemption or restoration for this river. So, Jenny Price is an environmental historian who moved to LA. I believe she lived in Missoula before that. And she made this crack in one of her articles. She said, Missoula is the kind of city where you can't throw an apple core into a bush and not hit an environmentalist. And she said, she announces to all of her colleagues, I'm moving to LA. And everyone's like, what? Why would you go to LA? You lived in Boulder, and now you're in Missoula. Why on earth would you go to LA? You're an environmentalist, for God's sake. She said, that's exactly why I'm going to LA. I'm going to go find the nature in LA. Going back to why it's important for us to live in urban centers. Most of us live in cities. If we can't find the nature in our cities, then it's hopeless, right? We need to understand what our relationship is in the places that we live, work, and play.
Thank you.
We need to see the rivers in our everyday landscapes. So most people have seen the LA River this way, in the movies.
Yes, thank you.
See that
Appreciate
in
it.
the 1930s, the Corps of Engineers concreted it, and occasionally when it rains, occasionally water will flood down. But for the most part, the river is dry. A group called the Friends of the LA River, FOLAR. I encourage you to look them up because they've been very successful in the last 15 to 20 years at reasserting the Los Angeles River into the public eye and into policy. So you can imagine where a group of activists starts in LA with trying to convince people that they even have a river, getting to the point that they actually have a plan that has been endorsed by the city council, and they're working on restoration projects. So they have been very successful. They have a lot of resources. One of the things that they started doing, like Jenny Price, was taking people on tours, actually getting them to the river. So I have a student in one of my classes who is from LA, and I asked him, I said, have you ever been to the LA River? And you know what he said? He said, can you get there on the 405? That he has no idea where the river is because there is no access to it. And so this is what it looks like from above. This is what it looks like as it flows through neighborhoods. And in 2007, this is one of the examples, the plans for what will happen. So the idea is to do green space. You can see there are sidewalks, there are steps. This allows for the water to rise if they do have flooding, and it won't take out the infrastructure. They're attempting to bring back. I don't think they're doing, their restoration is not necessarily, planting plants as much as it is letting the city naturally do, finding the places where the ducks already are and giving them better habitats. Another important thing to note is that the city has been strategic in where they have focused their revitalization efforts. They are not just going where the money is. They're not saying, here's a wealthy neighborhood, why don't we do a restoration project and put in public space here? But the city is going into poor Latino neighborhoods and saying, let's put in a space here, a green space here along the river through a revitalization effort. That is really, really key, because as you look at urban planning and you look at green space, it is not equitably distributed in our cities. It's very important that if we intend to look at health issues, public health issues, ecological health, social health, economic health, that when we revitalize and we renew and we redevelop, we need to do this with equity in mind, or we simply repeat the mistakes of the past. So, the Kansas cities. You guys know as much about this as I do, but I'm just going to run through a few examples of ways to examine the relationship that Kansas City has historically, where you have been, where perhaps I'd like to ask you think you are going. I do want to say that as you notice the beautiful shapeliness of the river and the city as they meet. In the 1950s, Kansas City's motto was that this was the heart of America. And they had a drawing to represent this that was a heart that was made by the rivers. And so culturally, right there, the rivers were at the center of its identity. You also now call yourself what? The city of fountains, yes. Is every one of those fountains not a connection and a way to celebrate the river? So these are cultural ways to think about this. What I want to suggest to you is that perhaps culture is one really important place to start thinking about changing relationships. So this is a poem by Donella Meadows, and it is about how we think about our relationships. So this fresh apple, still cold and crisp from the morning dew, is not me, only until I eat it. When I eat the soil that nourished the apple. When I drink, the waters of the earth become me. With every breath out, I exhale me into not me. That is the relationship that the river and the city have. You can't actually separate that. There is no me and not me. We see the river, we see ourselves, but you cannot actually separate these, not physically and not historically. So let's start with waterworks, the most obvious way that the river comes into this city. Kansas City has had 3 waterworks. They have shared these waterworks at times with Kansas City, Kansas. It's very important to see the region and not the city proper in environmental history and of the history of the river and cities. Cop Point was relocated because of pollution on the river. Ultimately, Cordero would be built. This was a private waterworks initiative. All the way up until 1898, when Kansas City, Missouri bought it, even though it was in Kansas City, Kansas. The reason why is that in the Progressive era, there was a general feeling that the city would do better for the public than would a private company. And that it was a critical time in the expansion of the city and in protection of public health, which has newly embraced the germ theory, to have abundant water. A private company is not interested in getting water to the people who can't pay for it. The private company served about 5,000 people, something like that, in the thousands, less than 10,000 people. So in 1898, when Kansas City, Missouri purchases Cordero, which it has been moved upstream for pollution reasons, from McCall to the Missouri. I'll show you a map in a minute. It has the intention of improving water quality and expanding quantity and access. Because you can't compete as a city in industrial America without abundant, clean water. You will get a bad reputation. So the water that came from Quindaro goes for 5 miles in a pipe that crosses the Cod River to the Turkey Creek pump station. The pump station, running on coal, sends it up into the city and into Maines. This flow line was lost in the 1903 flood. The city went for about 2 weeks with no water. This was a great lesson. Have you ever gone without water? You realize how essential water is to your daily life. People are just starting to get toilets in their homes at this time. Plumbing. The middle class that is starting to build homes. It's not quite the country club district yet, but some of these homes that are beginning to move away from the industrial area are putting plumbing in their houses. The new bungalows, for example. So not having water means you can't flush your toilet, you can't boil water for coffee, you can't wash your hands, you can't cook, etc., etc. Well, in order to prevent this from happening again, what they will decide to do is to tunnel the flow line under the Cod River. And that is opened by 1905. Here are people gawking at the flood in 1903. This is a drawing from the newspaper. You see the businessmen of the city. You can imagine businessmen from this area here who would walk, well, they probably would have been over here on the blocks. Yes, examining this flood. Union Station, over the West Bottoms. This is 1908 flood. What I want you to notice here, when we talk about, well, let's compare. All right, here basically, it looks like what we see are railroads, industries, etc. But there are plenty of people who live here during this time. Immigrants live here, the working class lives here. This is where the jobs are. This is the center of this is the busy part of the city. This is the hive. So a lot of people are going to have to be evacuated. They're going to be homeless. Here's an example. This is called Queen City. There also was nicknames for
Harlem.
Harlem on the north side, right? There are all kinds of little, the Patch was another one. These were largely African-American communities. So these are basically shanties. They don't own the land. They put up houses on the bluffs or in spaces down by the railroad tracks. When they're flooded out, they lose everything, and they don't have anything to go back to. They don't have any of the resources. So what I want to emphasize here is that when we examine resources and waterways in the city, there are upstream and downstream social relationships. It's always better to live upstream on the river. And those places in the city that are most at risk have the people who are most at risk. Literally, who do not have the economic resources in order to live in a better place, nor to recover from this kind of disaster. This happens again and again. Incidentally, these are also the places in the city that are not plumbed. These are the places in the city that don't have drinking water, access to city water, for example. So they don't have the best that the city has to offer to protect their public health. So the movement of the waterworks from Caw Point to Quindaro is in part, this is the Caw River. Each one of these black dots represents a source of pollution. It's an industry, some kind of factory, refinery, linseed oil production, etc., etc. And that is why, since it was downstream, Caw Point Waterworks has moved up here where there's no urbanization. And of course, you know today that this is where Kansas City, Kansas has their waterworks, and now they've moved to wells. Here is the African American community at the turn of the century. Notice that they live in older infrastructure. They live closer to the river in older infrastructure. Here's an example of an African American neighborhood. What this shows, if you can read maps like this, is that they have privy vaults, but they don't have plumbing. So they don't have access to city water or to city sewers. 90% of African Americans in Des Moines at this time did not own land. They rented. Landlords did not want to invest in putting in plumbing into their homes because A, they were motivated by profit. Why would I spend $1,000 to plumb this old house? And they also felt that African Americans would not know how to take care of it. So there was an innate prejudice about property care as well. And here is a photo. This is a dense community, and this is a row of houses. So if you don't have access to city plumbing, and you're drawing on a well, for example, or a nearby creek, or you're going down to the saloon, you have to remember that the water in this area is probably also contaminated by sewage, because you don't have the city infrastructure there. Typhoid fever was the number one, this is evidence that you have contamination of sewage or other kinds of fecal bacteria in your drinking water. Over half of Kansas Cityans have access to city water during the time that typhoid fever rates are so high. So the first decade of the 20th century, over half of Kansas Cityans have access to the city water, and yet look at the typhoid fever rates. Note that this is not just Kansas City's, it is the whole basin. So what happens is that we have enough urbanization, enough industrialization in the Missouri River Basin, places like Sioux City, Council Bluffs, St. Joseph. Meatpacking is the #1 business, and there are no regulations about sewage, so it's all going right into the river. So Kansas City's kind of a downstreamer here. And typhoid fever rates, low. Things changed 1912. This is when chlorination was introduced. That doesn't change the level of bacteria in the water. It simply makes that bacteria safe, or it simply renders that bacteria harmless. Thank you. So we're also in a big shift in medical science and the way that the public understands disease, going from the miasma theory to the germ theory. So even though scientists like Edward Koch, they may have already made the transition to the microscope, and they understand that there are, invisible things in the water that cause illness. The public doesn't necessarily believe that or understand that yet. And so at the turn of the century, people still assumed that they could rely upon how water looked to judge whether it was safe or not. So this would have been bad, this would have been good. So the city waterworks is a very important arbiter in this process. People trust what the city waterworks does. And increasingly with the germ theory, with expanded production, and with new facilities, the waterworks here is hiring scientists, they have a laboratory, they're testing the river twice a day, and they're treating the water. They're settling it, filtering it, and treating it. And a new waterworks has to be built in order to do all of this. And so this is the waterworks that you have today. This is a blueprint from 1922, I believe, for the waterworks that would ultimately open in 1928 in North Kansas City. Here's the old Quindaro right here. There are two major factors that caused Kansas City to build this big new plant. One is political, and the other simply has to do with the duties of the city. The city needs to produce quantity and quality. Kansas City is growing very quickly in the early 20th century, and Quindaro cannot supply its needs any longer. So it needs a plant that can pump out 100 million gallons of water a day. And it also needs a plant that can do so safely. It needs to be able to build all of these new technological adaptations to keep the water pure. So that's one reason. The other is the political reason. Note that Quindaro is in Kansas. Kansas City, Missouri, and Wyandotte County had a fierce battle in the Progressive Era when Darius Brown was mayor over whether or not Kansas City, Missouri needed to pay taxes to Kansas City, Kansas. And ultimately, it went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court said, hey, Casey Rome, you're going to have to pay your taxes. You own property, you got to pay for it. And so they had to pay like $100,000 in back taxes, which in 1915 is a lot of money. And this is part of the reason why, by the end of the 1910s, Kansas City is thinking, we're not going to build in Kansas anymore. We're going to come to the other side of the border in the city limits so that we can control our circumstances better. And thus the move. And this is what it looks like. This is in 1928, aerial photograph. Here it is. Here's where the water is coming in. And it goes into settling basins where the mud is settled out. It goes through a treatment plant that will chlorinate it and filter it. There's usually, I'm sure they're still using a coagulating process at this point as well to help get the sediment out. It then goes about roughly the same number of miles. It's pumped down the river and tunneled under, no more over the river, tunneled under the Missouri River in 3 giant pipes and to 3 different pump stations where it goes up into the city, and it's two, thank you, 2 pumps, Turkey Creek still, right?
Well, Turkey Creek got moved after the 51 flood.
All right, so
It got wiped out.
in 28, they're still using Turkey Creek. They're using East Bottoms and...
East Bottoms is original, it's still there.
Okay. So I think at the time, the reason I say that is because there are 1, 2, 3 here.
Yeah, but there's only 2. There's
Now-
one shaft and it's
Okay.
split.
Okay. So this is part of the urban innards, the invisible network that is sustaining the city. This is the me, not me. You can't separate it. This is a part of every single body in Kansas City. It's a part of the infrastructure of Kansas City. You can't get away from the river. And the river can't get away from us. So this is an outfall. This is a sewer outfall, a photo taken in 1922 at the base of Turkey Creek, which is the largest sewer outfall for Kansas City, Missouri, although it's in Kansas City, Kansas. Everything that comes...
That's still there. That's the way it looks like today.
Except it's...
No, it
Well-
looks exactly like that today.
You'll
On the McCall
actually...
River.
Yes, but it doesn't have raw sewage coming out.
That's Turkey Creek. I know what comes out that pipe. I worked there.
Largest CSO in the area.
So whatever goes in must come out, right? It's a law. So all of the water that is coming into these middle-class new homes, the country club districts, all of these homes, the water has to go somewhere. All of our sewer systems that tend to be built around our riverways and our stream systems because of gravity. Can't get away from that law either. So this actually relates to what you're saying with Turkey Creek. So Turkey Creek is not a big river, it's a creek that starts back here some 15 miles away and weaves its way through Kansas City, Kansas, what used to be Rosedale, crosses the state line right there for just like 800 feet. Like, it's not been in Missouri for very long. But if you think of the layout of Kansas City, Missouri, it ends up taking the waste from 2/3 of the city. And then travels back into Kansas City, Kansas, for 100 yards. So, this is a bit of a problem. All right? So this is what it looks like when it comes out in Kansas City, Kansas, in the McCall River. But it's taking the majority of Kansas City, Missouri sewage, even though it just barely comes in here. So, this is a problem for 20 years. And it takes a really long time to make a big infrastructure shift, particularly when you're on a state line. Finally, the decision was made to make a cutoff for Turkey Creek, to take the water flowing upstream that doesn't have a sewer running into it, and to send that creek directly to the Cog River with a shortcut. And to take the rest of the creek here that takes the sewage and put it under the ground as part of the storm sewer system. And that's where we get the southwest traffic way here. That's Turkey Creek is under there. And you no longer have raw sewage running in a stream for 2/3 of the city in an open stream. Boy, do people complain about that. But however, you still have this. Kansas City, Kansas continue to complain because they're like, great, thanks a lot, we really appreciate it. It's always nice to be downstream. But they weren't too mad about it because ultimately, Kansas City, Missouri is downstream from us, right? So it's like a cycle. You're all downstream from everything, right? Because this is just going to head right on into Missouri. So this was a big issue from the 1910s, finally solved by the 1930s. Infrastructure that you have today, I'm sure that you know here in Kansas City, is old and it's aging, right? Every single day. This infrastructure is largely built by the 30s. Your sewer systems, your water systems, 80% of people have access to city water and sewers by the 1930s. New Deal funds provide a lot of that access. So the urban infrastructure is really pushed forward, access much broader and greater access during the 1930s. Even though it's safer to drink the city water, that doesn't mean that the pollution levels or bacteria levels in the water have decreased. So here we start, like right here when we have typhoid fever problems. Look at the bacteria counts over the years. They remain high. There is a change right here, drop, because of the Clean Water Act and federal regulations. So, I suggested to you at the beginning that Kansas City is a river city. This has been a happy marriage. It has been a marriage that was having a golden anniversary until 1951. And I think the 1950s really put the nail in the coffin of the marriage, the relationship that the city has with the river. It doesn't mean that the river's not important to the city. It means that culturally and infrastructurally, the city has begun to move away from the river. The 1950s for two reasons. One is, this is the 51 flood. This is Fairfax here that you can see is underwater. Big flood in 1951. Lots of businesses just decide not to rebuild in the bottoms. Lots of homes, people leave, they may have been there for 50 years, they decide not to rebuild their homes. Lots of infrastructure that is not repaired. So people shift away from the bottoms. The second is that this is the post-war era. There's an incredible suburban boom. All of this new home building that is happening. And so there are replacement homes for those people who should decide not to rebuild. So there is less attention paid to the core, to the place where we are now, and more focus, more money is going to the outskirts of the city. This is an image that I found in the Kansas City Public Library from the 1950s. I don't know who the author is. We don't have an exact date. We just know that it dates to the 50s. And it's a very good example of how Kansas City has begun to drift away from the river. This artist does not see the river in the city's present. His present is the 1950s. He sees the river in the city's past. And fast forward to the late 20th century and the 21st century, when I started my work on the Missouri River, and I was like, I'm going to get a picture of the river. And the only way that I could do that was got it. And I did it back. But then Berkeley Park opens, and actually we know that this was 2007. Berkeley Park is underway by this time. Actually, I don't know if you know this, but Berkeley Park wasn't the first time that a city park was planned there. That was actually the second iteration of a city park. The first one was failure. This is the very first river relief here in Kansas City. And 600 people showed up, most of whom had never been to the river before. The infrastructure is not there. And it opens people's eyes. And I would submit to you that the work that many of you are doing, getting people down to the river, is a really important part of the cultural turn. A turn in beginning to see this city as part, or this river as part of the city, and seeing the relationship that people have to the city, and establishing that relationship more directly. And then here is Muse of Missouri, the fountain down on, is it on Main? Yes. Okay. Fountain on Main. I'm very fond of this photo. This actually photo was taken in the 60s. And I think this is a very good example of the kind of public art. It's not a public space really. We would have to dodge traffic in order to get close to the mountain. But there's so much potential. You saw in all of the other cities how public space, public art, investment near the river brings people and brings business and ultimately helps to shift the dialogue about the relationship that we have with this river. Because all of these things will connect back to politics, economics, the public health issues. So I would love to hear what you think. I'll take questions. I'd love to hear what you think about how things have to be done to shift. I'll bet you can tick off names of organizations that have started and activities that are going on in the last 10 years or so, and how you see this shift happening. Yes?
I want a dock. That's all I want is a dock. We've got some ramps. Ramps are great, get you in the water. But if you can't do something as simple as pull your boat up so you can let people in, it's a chicken and egg thing, I realize. And we had some docks up off Top Point for a while when we were doing the Lewis and Clark celebration, but the government pulled those out because the maintenance was too great. We don't have a way, we have a way to get into the river, but we don't really have a way to get other people comfortably in boats on the river. And it's something to me almost that simple beyond getting gas and other little minor things. So how did some of the other cities tackle just the very basic start of something like facility?
Not very many of these cities have, Portland does have, they have a city dock, and they have probably a private dock, so they have people with sailboats, etc. They do have an infrastructure there, but it actually is a commercial waterway as well. So they have big boats. All of the bridges over the river have to be able to open to let big boats through. So they're running a commercial river. But some of these cities have, they don't have the boats on them. They just have public space around. But on the other hand, some places like San Antonio, someone was saying yesterday that Oklahoma City now has gondolas. Even Phoenix. Even Phoenix has its own little river now. It's not real. It's made to look like it. That's a really good question. Yes, some of them do. For example, probably most notably is the LA River. The LA River, when it was engineered in the 30s by the Corps, has a little central divot where initially this was to keep the sewage flow. And you can kayak in it. There are fantastic photos of this large concrete trench with this little narrow passageway that the kayaks can just fit through. But if it rains there, then because of all the impermeable surface, they have lots of water in the river, but just for a short time.
And how long is the road stay? How
Day or two.
lengthwise?
A day or two.
I think Missouri River creates a lot of railroad problems than smaller rivers.
Yeah.
Comes to flooding,
Right.
when you receive it. And it recedes all the way up to that.
You could use that seasonal change as, I guess it's a teaching tool, the seasonal changes. Although it's not really seasonal anymore because it's not tied to the large season as much as it is to climate, to weather patterns.
My personal feeling about unless you get people on the river, they aren't going to be walking by a pretty path is not going to be the same. They would not claim the river and be involved with it as if they were on the river.
The 40s created a lot of river mania, and it's brought a lot of people for a very short time. It brings a lot of emphasis, and people that don't normally come to the river come to watch. I think that's really been great.
How did that get started?
Started in 2006, just 15 people went for it, and it's just grown since then. Last year, I think 350 boats started, 500 plus people on the river. This is getting ready to have the 8th.
There were 3 things that bring people down to this river. We talked a little bit about it last night. One is a big river cleanup. We're having one on the Blue River, about 1,000 people. The Missouri River consistently brings up 500. So those river cleanups are huge. This race is amazing. I mean, people line the banks. There's a house that's up on a bluff that calls down in a bullhorn. Hey, guy from Arkansas, way to paddle. You think it's God, because he has no idea. So, I mean, this is embraced seriously in a big way. Almost $1 million of tourism to Missouri because of that race. And the third thing, you guys, is a flood. If that water comes up, they are lined at the gate. At Cop Point, Jill's laughing because I ran into her at flood. I mean, we run into each other. Oh, you're flood watching. Oh, we are too. And that's the third thing. So we've got to find other ways to get people down there. I think there's great stuff happening, but things like Berkeley Park and the pedestrian walkway at Main Street, work that's been done at Cop Point, the work that's going to be done up in Parkville. It was just announced this week. There's stuff happening downstream at Lubbock. I just think there's tons of opportunity.
Of the cities that have gone back down to the river with what they've done, what city is the most successful?
Which aspect of it or which thing?
Which aspect has been most successful?
Green space, very important. But the green space is not in isolation. The exception is Grand Forks, where the green space kind of is in isolation. But a lot of these spaces have commercial districts nearby, so that people are going down to walk along the river, but they can stop by and have coffee nearby as well. Very important, though, to note that most of these are public spaces and not private spaces. So there might be private space nearby, but the most successful of these are when you have a public commitment to create this space and to preserve it. Which is, it's not the same as privatizing like a mall. This is not a mall.
Education has to be a major component because many people are not educated on it. They are afraid of it. perceive it as a dangerous spot. Yet they'll go to Lake Ozarks and their speedboats on the weekend and party, and that's more dangerous than going out on the river. And it's a preconceived idea that it's dangerous or you'll be sucked under the water. People, there's a lot of ignorance about the river, so we can have green space. That's great, but we can't educate them and get them to rethink, to restructure what they think. It's a hard sell.
Yeah.
And you can tell them that if they drink that water, they have that water this morning, they brush their teeth with the bath. They just can't believe it. They don't relate. They don't know how connected they are to that river.
And that definitely speaks to the cultural, aspect of understanding.
You mentioned Des Moines is ranked in 2 categories, one being a great place to retire. What was the other?
Best place for young professionals.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Google Fiber Initiative here in Kansas City? Kansas City was selected by Google to deploy fiber to the home to offer extremely high-speed bandwidth. It was a big competition, and Kansas City, Kansas, and Missouri were selected for Google's initial deployment. So I've been noodling. I'm a tech wonk. I walk in that space, and so I've been noodling in my head, how could we possibly leverage all the buzz, and I've been around this community for a long time, and there's tremendous buzz in the younger, run around with your hair on fire youth of today. How do we combine that Google phenomenon with getting people down to the river? And so one thought is, let's deploy wireless through Call Point, high-speed Google fiber, or high-speed wireless with Google as the backbone to some place like Caw Point, and let the young Turks bring their laptops down, get by the river, and do whatever the young Turks do, but then have boats and get them out on the river. And this gets back to river relief. I'm very involved with river relief, have been. But there is a transformative process that goes on when people get on that river that have never been there. So I think with the younger generation and the advent of social media, I mean, it's a phenomenal thing that happens when buzz gets going. And I think if Kansas City could figure out how to leverage the buzz, then we might be able to take some steps that we haven't taken yet. I haven't figured that out yet. That's what I noodle on when I have spare time.
Portland, Oregon did that in public space. For Pioneer Square, for example, which is a big public square in downtown Portland. It's a few blocks away from the waterfront, but again, we come back to public space. That they made free Wi-Fi. It's like 10 years ago back. It was not quite as, at that time, it was a big deal. Now just be able to sell buildings around it. So they did do that in order to keep it a vibrant public space. And it was for young people also.
Attitude is the fire that heats the water, that makes the stream, that makes the wheels go in. I've been in and out of Kansas City for years and years and years, and I like this town. So we have an attitude about, I went with a large hiking group about 3 years ago. Started out right here and went all the way to the casino. And what we found were fear because of the homeless people that were down there that were threatening. We found a sleeping bag that was covered with blood, laying right alongside it. And we find tires, we find junk. We're preaching to the choir here. We need to do something to change the outlook. This is a good city. But by golly, we still got water mains in this town that are made of wood. So we've got our priorities out of line, and we're in an economic spending problem. We've got to keep it simple, stupid, but we've got to change that attitude. And I don't know how we do it.
You need some tune for us. You need to have young people who know how to use high tech, who will do, I don't mean like graffiti, like illegal graffiti, but who will offer up the arts to help change the way that spaces are viewed. I'm actually thinking of Dubuque, Iowa, a city I've never even been to, but I've read about this group of young people there, artists, and they call themselves the Do-Nighters. And because they wanted something, they were a bunch of artists, you know, maybe they were from Dubuque, maybe they had moved to Dubuque, and they decided, you know, we all have families and jobs now, we never get to do our art anymore. What do you say we pick a day a week and we all get together and just do art? And they ended up becoming this kind of public, like, guerrilla's not quite the right word, because that makes it sound like it's really good. But doing public art, but they would be extemporaneous about it. And so here's something that they did that relates to the river's history. Dubuque is on the Mississippi River. They created a monster they call the Kraken. And the Kraken looks like kind of like an octopus. It's fuchsia, it's bright pink. And they started making it in pieces. So they made like one arm out of pink fabric. And it was really long, like, you know, 20 feet long. And they got someone in a building downtown near the river to donate their window, and it comes up out of the window and down the building. And they started this story, the myth of the Kraken, which is kind of like the Loch Ness that lives in the Mississippi River, and how it also lives in the sewer system. And so in doing this little mythology, they end up linking city and river, and they're working in the downtown area, this older part that's just being revitalized right now. And then, you know, another week they put together another arm and it went up somewhere. And so people started wondering, where's the Kraken going to appear next? And it becomes a place that people are driving to Dubuque to get to see this Kraken. And so I'm, you know, maybe that's a cultural attitude. That's where the young people who are tech savvy, who are artists can come in, where they employ their creativity to do something that can't happen anywhere else. It only exists here in this time, in this place, for this, you know, it has this history. Something that's original. You said the name. They call themselves the Do-Nighters. N-I-G-H-T. Yeah.
who started out being involved in graffiti, and I don't mean to tell you, but spray paint art, who were involved with the River Festival in St. Louis, who were invited spray paint artists from all around in conjunction with the festival to sell the river. And there's an artist, I can't think of his name, the Leopold Gallery in Brookside, who works with all the school groups, and they work with somebody, I think, in this group to take these art kids out onto the river and to do projects. And I think the seed has been planted, but you know, only one maybe has germinated.
How important is depiction art here? And we've all, and a lot of people that make construction art. So how important is art in revitalizing?
I think it's actually really important. In looking at what other cities have done, that's been a really important part of what they have. So like in Des Moines, where I'm seeing all this change happening downtown, we actually have recently redone our waterfront. But we've also we've also made some changes that are away from the waterfront. So that what's interesting is that things have kind of moved from the waterfront and then moving in, so that all of downtown's kind of being touched. The other thing is that the eastern gateway, or it's the western gateway, the other side of downtown, we have a sculpture garden. And the sculpture garden has become, it's actually private, kind of, but it's maintained like a public space. It's open, it's just art with sidewalks around it. So I have been so surprised how much attention it gets. Dinner on a Friday night, and that place is full of teenagers. It is the place for teenagers to go. And you go on Sunday, it's families and their strollers. Tourists are coming. So there are all these great pieces of art that you're not supposed to climb on. You're just supposed to climb on them. Twice as exciting. But they're lovely to look at as well. And so that's away from the river, but that has been a huge draw, putting that sculpture garden in. And you can see how the river and the sculpture garden now have all of this development around them. And I think they'll eventually come.
I think we're encouraged to organize Kansas City to have a traffic today. Because other topics like this one are hard to like. And they like to get I think it would be I can see the wagons go on the birthday park on Friday night. Music. Get the kids down.
I think you need the most spectacular pedestrian bridge that's ever been built. You need the Space Needle in Kansas City, and it needs to be over. It needs to be a piece of art, and it needs to put people right next to the river. It has to attract them. It has to be something that is stunning, so that people go for that, and then once they're there, they realize, oh yeah, I got around down here, then it attracts the development. Maybe a Heart of America pedestrian bridge that actually goes from Cobb Point to West Bottoms to North Kansas City. So it's a three-pronged bridge. Something spectacular, I think. And then it becomes the icon of the city. It becomes that which you get into people associate, just like with Seattle, that Space Needle. I don't know why we associate. What is the Space Needle? I don't know. I just know that when I think of Seattle, I think of the Space Needle. When I think of Portland, I think of its bridges. You know, Kansas City doesn't have, and think of what you do when you're then over the river and you look back and you see the skyline. That's so much of how Kansas City portrays itself is the skyline, right? That's what's iconic. But you have to go down to the river to have that perspective on the skyline, right?
Why don't they start on this end and clean this up, because they're getting all that going hill road. Between here and the casino, they've got that all cleaned out right down here. It's still pretty rustic right here. And they've got a basis here where they can start. They were once, I lived in Fort Wayne for a couple of years, and they've got three rivers come together in downtown. And they cleaned all that out, and it is fantastic. They got festivals, they got food festivals, they got band festivals. There's something going on every single weekend. Each ethnic group, they have a Spanish, a German, all that. And it goes because of population from this material.
Yeah, I would say that most cities that have done revitalization of the river and have a public space also use it for festivals, and so that they draw big crowds.
Where are you going?
So there's this guy who works for, it's been so long, I met him at a conference. I want to say he works for USGS, and he gave me GPS coordinates.
What's the name?
What is his name?
No, her name.
I don't know, but there's a jar on the rock there.
Yeah, I think where,
Yes, well, that's actually what's about to happen. I saw a grizzly man, and now it's ruined it. I had no fear of grizzlies until I saw that. Yes.
Just 3 or 4 points. All one has to do is go and walk across the pedestrian bridge in Omaha to realize what you're speaking of. If you haven't done that, and then you got to do that, and then the momentum is a whole different feeling. And another point that I wanted to make from what I know about it is that Dodge Park, for example, or Sioux City particularly, is the best example of if you build it, they will come as far as river development. Sioux City particularly is you just can't believe. You think you've gone to the Lake of the Ozarks when you are there anywhere on that reach of the river. So that's the best example. And that type of development can happen in the lower reach of the river. It is engineering possible. The pedestrian bridge in Omaha is something everyone really needs to experience because it is a unique connection in the nation to a river particularly. And when you talk about the skyline and things like that, it has huge potential for what you're wanting to do. And then somebody spoke earlier about what is the best thing to bring attention. Caring and the buy-in, so to speak, is if you get people to bring their kayak, their pleasure boat, their canoe to your venue. Because then you can have the grandmas or you can have the 8-year-olds. And when you do that, so somebody was talking about the dock development. And I'm involved in a community that everything we do with the river is like pulling teeth. But we did manage to, through U.S. Fish and Wildlife offers a Tier 1 and a Tier 2 grant that would allow you to build a dock as St. Joe did. And that project ended up being about $238,000. And the city had to only contribute $38,000 of it. The $200,000 came on this non-compete yearly grant that's offered from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It's administered through MDC, Missouri Department of Conservation, handles that grant, or making sure all the plans get done correctly and stuff like that, crossing the T's and dotting the I's. But that boat dock then does what you're saying, I believe, about if you bring a boat dock, which is a simple thing, that you have that one thing there, then that brings the family that gets into the river. And if you spend one day or one weekend at the Sioux City area, then you understand that we actually live in a far better part of the river for recreating when it comes to that type of thing. So that would be a possibility to check in through U.S. Fish and Wildlife. MDC, I'm sure, is quite aware of that. That's a yearly thing. As a matter of fact, St. Joe was so bad about it and so lackadaisical that it's $100,000 a year is you're allowed, unless you do a Tier 1, and then it starts up to $1 million Tier 1 grant available, which we're trying to exercise in building a safe harbor type facility. Another story, but we actually applied for it for 2 years and got it 2 years in a row because there's a pent up demand for that type of thing when St. Joe finally got done. Another thing, that venue there is like pulling teeth, that we constantly had people on the call-in shows up there saying, I want the pothole fixed in my front yard. I don't want to build that dock out there. If all there is big snakes and whirlpools on that river, what are you doing? Well, first of all, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife grant only comes from user fees. If you're buying hunting license and fishing material, that's where all the money comes from. So we squelched that argument because it's, again, the money didn't come from us, so to speak, unless you were using the wildlife, so to speak. So that was just 3 or 4 points I heard you guys talking about. And recreation is the key. And not just walking along the bank. You've got to put them out there floating on the canoes, the houseboats, the pontoons. And once they see a couple dozen on those beautiful Sunday and Saturday afternoon floating by, tied up like they do, even in St. Joe to some degree. Nothing like Sioux City where 10 or 15 boats would be tied together, floating on the magic carpet. On one end of the parade is rock and roll, the other end is country western. There's 50 people in the water, and it's floating, and it's going, and they do that for hours. So when you see that driving by or whatever it be, walking along the bank, you think, yeah, I'd rather be there. So again, that really brings life to the party, and that thing we all need to make it happen, the money. And when somebody brings that type of person to your venue, their boat, which brings 5 or 6 people, all ages are available to enjoy it from whatever it is, fishing, swimming, just floating on the water. So
Sioux City is a good example. They've done a great job. In fact, they took a lane out on the bridge to create a pedestrian and bike path, so that you can cross. Another way that you can increase, Portland actually has a hanging bridge under the bridge for pedestrians and bikes.
That'd be cool.
So there are ways that you can retrofit the infrastructure that you have.
Yep.
This might be related, but is there any evidence as far as like these green spaces and these spaces to creating like corridors for wildlife traffic?
That's a good question.
You repeat her question, please?
She asked if green spaces along the rivers have helped to create wildlife corridors.
Sure.
I don't,
You can stand on the bank here and look across the river and see deer every day.
Yeah. No, it's a definite benefit. If you think about the especially migratory birds and so forth, that little bit of green space with water next to it is huge.
We track turkeys every year off the airport, right across the river.
So, I mean, in all reality, it sounds like it's not, I mean, recreation is one avenue that we can take as far as like, basically generating revenue. But so is, I mean, if we have this kind of, we're creating this kind of natural traffic anyway, and could we generate revenue, just for people that, I mean, these are ducks and geese, people want that, right?
Yeah, bird watching is huge. It's a very big economic factor for people. So yeah, it is a definite draw.
And just outside the city limits, there are people who duck hunt, geese hunt, right outside Parkville. Just downstream of 291. There's a bunch of people that put in a truly lake down there and duck hunt and do something on the river.
So, what efforts is it that's going to happen with Trestle? I know some different people there now.
Parkville it's Platte Landing Park. It's both a recreation and an ecosystem it's both park recreation and ecosystem restoration. The park master plan is being developed currently, so is the ecosystem restoration plan. The park plan tentatively will go out to construction sometime this summer. The ecosystem restoration plan depends upon federal funding to get the implementation of it. But Platte County is the head sponsor for it. There are plans available on the Platte County website that'll show you what's happening. A lot of open space. There will be some ball fields. Ecosystem restoration is focusing on the wetlands that are on the site, actually restoring those and actually enhancing them, as well as enhancing the riparian corridor along Rush Creek. Or Rush Creek, not Rush.
At the
And there is a boat ramp.
at the Platte County Commission meeting March 4th, they approved entering into 2 agreements for a total expenditure of about $700,000. $300,000 from Homeland Security grant to actually build a boat ramp at Platte Landing Park. Platte Landing Park is in the flyway of KCI. There is no access to the river should there be an air emergency along the river. The closest is Call Point, and it's 10 miles away. The next one is Leavenworth, and it's 12 miles away. So Homeland Security provided $300,000 to put a boat ramp in, but there was no money to provide public access to that. They were against public access, but they weren't going to provide any money to bring the public there. So the Department of Conservation worked with Platte County. We are funneling federal monies in there to do $400,000 worth of access road, parking lot, privy, launch apron to get to that boat ramp. And we'll expend 0 state dollars to get this done. It'll all be federal sport fish restoration and boating access funds. And then Platte County in order to get $700,000 project, they're gonna end up spending about $75,000 to get that done.
But mind you, they are also kicking in over $1 million into that park project.
Yes,
So the park amenities that are going in are being funded by the county, and that's over $1 million in and of itself.
and those type of facilities, any kind of, having baseball fields on the bank of the river is a great use of that property, because baseball fields can be flooded.
Soccer fields, yeah.
Soccer fields can be flooded. When the water goes down, they're still there. Structures in the floodplain are a different story. And, the levee system along the Missouri River was never created properly, according to the original master plan that Pick Sloan set out. Corps of Engineers had basically said there will be 1 mile between the bluff and the levee on the opposite bank, or between levee and levee, should the river route be further than 1 mile from the bluff. So what that allows is the water to come up, spread out before it goes up again. Well, Congress didn't fund that, so levee districts were formed to protect all this new ground that was created by draining the river. And now, the levees that were built weren't built 5,000 feet apart. They were built right at the river, right at the river's edge, so you could farm all you could farm. And so now the river, the 1993 flood, actually took less water than the 1951 flood. So there's a lot of things that have gone in. The river is swift. It's not dangerous. It's just swift. But swift water and inexperienced boaters can be tricky. I took 20 canoe flotilla out one day, and 2/3 of them had never been in a canoe in their life. And we floated from Labadee all the way down to Napoleon, and we never flipped anybody. And they all were able to navigate just fine. It's just a matter of getting people. You don't have to get them really on the river, you got to get them to the edge. Because once you see flowing water, it stirs something. We all have it. We all have it in us. We have flow within our bodies, and seeing flowing water is mesmerizing. So just getting people there, and Platte Landing Park is going to be a big asset to the region. And there are still lots of things that can be done here along the riverfront. Unfortunately, the best place to do it is on the other side of the river, where we're not dealing with the navigation channel being right up against this bank. So, but we're working in the area. We're using what funds are available. It's just a matter of getting a lot of public support for what we do.
I would hitch, if you have to hitch yourself to any course, I think it's to frame much of what you want to do as a help is really important, because there are many aspects of it, and that's how you want to organize. You want to collaborate with other groups who may not have the same ultimate goal, but you all agree on health. So here, this is an example where recreation and amenity is good for people being able to exercise. That is good for public health. It's also good for ecological health. It will be good for economic health. So the way that we plan our cities around our rivers allows for river rats to agree with nurses, to agree with biologists. And I think health is the one umbrella that everybody can fit under. And there's also funding for that as well. I have thought
Well, neither did I. The Platte County Sheriff's Department applied for a grant and got it, and had no clue how to make it work. So it ended up with the Parks and Rec Department, who is working with consultants and us to get it done. It's going to be an extraordinary facility when it's done. There will be 50 boat catfish tournaments going out of there 3 or 4 times a year.
It's on the reserve.
It's on the reserve. Well, it is immediately upstream of English Landing, right in Parkville.
It's the next, it's that first crop field right there, right, just on the west side of Main Street. 130 acres.
Yeah, big development.
Have you, and they've already started pushing dirt?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
They're finalizing plans now, they'll go out to bid late spring or early summer.
It's right above the English Landing ramp.
Yep.
And then English Landing ramp will still be there then?
It will be, English Landing ramp was a horribly built ramp.
I know. It used to be the only ramp in town, so I know.
Horribly constructed ramp. Hopefully this ramp works out good because I walked out there and went, you're gonna put it right here. So hopefully it works out. The topography looks perfect for a ramp. The flow looks perfect. Where the existing ramp is, will still be a canoe launch, still be a good place to launch a kayak. It won't be for trailer boats.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.